Hi there. In this video, as promised, I'll be discussing some of the issues of previous socialisms. This will span many different nations and time periods in order to cover as many interesting points as possible, as briefly as possible. Of course, I'll be providing a little context to faults as they didn't occur in a vacuum, and almost all of them happened as a direct result to impending threats or serious difficulties that were near impossible to overcome at the time. This is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just quick examples of faults that could be learned from. One of the first points, albeit a smaller one, is competing with the West. One of the earliest faults, in my mind, this point applies more to the USSR than smaller socialist countries, but nonetheless is still a mistake. The USSR started from a position similar to that of Brazil, or the Middle East and North Africa region, more appropriately the West Asia and North Africa region. For it to go from a semi-feudal backwater to a spacefaring superpower in a few decades is incredibly impressive. Nonetheless, it framed itself as the alternative to American capitalism. This framing, itself, as the competing equal to the US, was a grave mistake since it immediately made the USSR seem outclassed in some regards, which is to be expected since the two nations started from incredibly different circumstances. The second point being military overspending. Defending your borders is one thing, attempting to stay in parity with the US is another. It's completely understandable, based on Soviet historical experience, why they always maintained such a large, sophisticated military, but that did eat into the Soviet Union's ability to further improve the lives of its people, and also for scientific discovery. Many of the best and brightest minds were pushed into military development with noticeable effects. An alternative that makes sense to me, although I by no means have all the facts, would have been to remain untouchable through nuclear weapons, rather than keeping such a well-maintained standing army. Whether this is the correct course or not, this is something that will require serious study in the future. The only thing clear is that the USSR erred in this regard. Point number 3. Lack of economic diversity in smaller socialist nations. Many smaller socialist countries, sometimes under the advice of the USSR or on their own accord, maintained an economy with a very narrow level of diversity. Cuba was such an example, with a focus on agricultural produce, mainly sugar. Only recently, within the past 20 years, has Cuba began more heavily diversifying, in light of the special period. This also somewhat applies to certain smaller Soviet republics, like Uzbekistan, with cotton, for example. This was not a rule, however, and certain countries, Bulgaria, the GDR, not to mention the USSR as a whole, etc., had incredibly diverse and well-developed economies. This kind of leads me into the issue of big brother socialist countries encouraging what they consider good strategy on other nations. Essentially, the development of self-sufficient industry and high-diversity economies, coupled with narrow areas of specialization, would allow for, what I believe to be, more fraternal cooperation between socialist nations, in which every single one can nonetheless stand on their own for all basic needs. This existed in one sense in the former socialist countries, but not nearly to a sufficient level. Point number 4. Not enough light industry. An issue that arose right from the start of the USSR was the divide between heavy and light industry. Heavy industry lends very well to the immediate needs of the nation as a whole, allowing for the production of heavy machinery, steel and iron, resources for infrastructure development, building material, and, of course, military technology. This is what's required to develop housing, roads, hospitals, a strong military, and almost everything else required on a national level. Light industry, on the other hand, is what's necessary for our needs as individuals. Wood products, home appliances, textiles, all sorts of food products, cleaning products, things for personal hygiene, amongst many other things. I'm reminded of an old Soviet professor that said to her students, "You complain that we produce Sputniks and not lingerie." That, in essence, is the divide. Although all of us can explicitly admit that the conquering of space and the development of national infrastructure is best, we cannot ignore the fact that, for many, happiness is in the small things. Beauty creams and toasters and variety in textiles have a much larger impact on the satisfaction of a population than the fact that we have built a new dam or that we have taken images of the far side of our galaxy. In hindsight, the Soviet strategy on focusing on heavy industry was right, as Bukharin's emphasis on light industry would have resulted in a Soviet Union with a much weaker capacity to firstly absorb the German invasion and secondly to carry the war to victory. Had the Soviet leadership not emphasized heavy industry, you and I may be speaking German right now, and also dead because we're communists. Despite the fact, the very emphasis on heavy industry and a relatively smaller emphasis on light industry resulted in some level of discontent among certain sectors of the Soviet population. In fact, many people who had a problem with Soviet society complained of primarily one thing: lack of variety or quality in consumer goods. Humans are strange creatures. This, of course, was the strategy of the USSR, and hence was imported without much thought into many socialist countries, resulting in similar shortages, or inadequacies, of consumer goods, and a surplus of heavy industry, for example in countries like Romania or Poland. Point number 5. Not enough democratic participation. Of course, the modern bourgeois peddled notion that there was no democracy in the former socialist experiments is blatantly false. There was democracy of a different kind, a proletarian democracy, which resulted in societies far more democratic than any Western liberal democracy. Cuba is a living example of said socialist democracy. Regardless, just because the Soviet Union or the GDR was more democratic than the US, a fact only those blind to ideology deny, does not mean that those nations were without fault. There was definitely more room for workplace democracy, as the state it was in the USSR was relatively underdeveloped and unsatisfactory for socialist expectations. The system of trade union representation was not as independent as one would hope, and there were way too many rubber stamping committees to be comfortable. Of course, all this arose from this or that necessity, but it's something we must learn to avoid in the future. On the other hand, most of the issues I currently have with Soviet political democracy have been corrected, or are in the process of being corrected, in Cuba. A great book on this topic is Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion by Arnold August. However, other positions certain groups within the left take issue with, I still defend. Primarily the existence of only one single party, as well as democratic centralism. I'm only mentioning these for posterity's sake. Many leftists disagree with these points, and not all socialist countries are single party. The GDR and DPRK are notable exceptions. Point number 6. Restrictions on cultural expression. This is a particularly severe point. Considering the USSR, there was a strong drive at first for local cultural expression, the development of local languages, the maintenance of local traditions and religions, amongst other things. Around the mid-30s, a subtle change occurred, with local language scripts being changed to Cyrillic, for example. Not that big of a deal, but still not ideal. The biggest changes occurred during the Brezhnev era and onward. Passive Russification took place, in that there was never any repression of a particular ethnicity, but in order to climb higher in life, as well as through the dissemination of Russian culture throughout the republics, many mastered Russian instead of their native tongues, adopted Russian traditions, started naming their children Russian names, and for all intents and purposes became Russian. This, combined with the moving of Russian technical experts into the small republics, spread some level of discontent, and directly contributed to the reactionary petty nationalisms of non-Russian ethnicities towards the end of the USSR. This reached its tip when in Kazakhstan, Kazakhs not only became a minority in their own republic, but the Central Committee of the Kazakh branch of the Communist Party had not a single Kazakh on it. I don't think I need to explain how grave a mistake this was. In my personal opinion, this was one of the worst, most easily avoided mistakes of the USSR. In another vein, Albania also had incredibly strange and unnecessarily repressive limits on cultural expression. An example of this would be the name list, an official list of first names you could name your child, which were supposedly neutral, purely so-called Albanian names. Mild repression hit what we would consider Christian names, but the blunt of the repression, similar with every other aspect in Albania, hit the Muslim population. People with traditionally Islamic names were forced to change their name to neutral Albanian, or ironically, and I believe somewhat intentionally, to Christian ones. This has absolutely no need and is honestly so fucking stupid. There are other examples of this sort of thing, and again, I don't think I need to explain why this is wrong and why we should learn from it in the future. Point number 7. Repression of religious practice. Building up from the previous point, the severe repression of religious expression was one of the, if not the worst mistakes of the former socialist experiments. Religion is something that will always remain in one way or another, particularly in historically religious communities. Religious communities of all types survived and adapted from slave societies to feudal or other pre-capitalist formations through capitalism and will definitely endure in one way or another during socialism and eventually communism. For a socialist government to not only deny public religious expression of any kind, but to also actively repress it with militant atheist gangs wandering the countryside, yes, this happened, and active anti-religious education in schools only lends reactionary forces power. Religion is an incredibly powerful tool, and every religious tradition lends itself very well to socialist ideals. If one were intelligent, they'd rather utilize religion as a driving force for participation in socialist society, and wield it as a weapon against other sorts of reaction. If you don't do that, what ends up happening is that this tool will fall into the hands of reactionary forces, who are highly motivated and usually well-armed and supported by foreign powers, to undermine the power of the socialist state. That, and also the massive discontent amongst religious masses. An often ignored aspect for local discontent in the Central Asian republics was this very issue, and it directly aided those espousing petty nationalism with calls for us being able to practice our own religion in our own country, finally. I have heard too many stories from people I know having to secretly baptize their children, or people having to hide religious texts in false walls and secret pits in fear of the authorities. My own father, who studied many years in the USSR, on a trip to Azerbaijan, had people follow him to his hotel room begging him to teach them how to recite the Quran properly. This is not what socialism should stand for, and is definitely something that deserves the most severe condemnation. If you want humanity, the vast majority of which is religious in one form or another, behind your political cause, you need to have a coherent and positive religious strategy. Don't forget, the reasons many Muslims supported the Bolsheviks early on is because they've promised they defend their mosques and their right to worship. Point number 8. Deportations. Another severe point of criticism. This happened in the USSR during the German invasion with a select group of nationalities. The idea being that certain reactionary sections of said populations either collaborated with the Germans, were planning on collaborating, or were under suspicion of collaborating. Now, for the actions of a few hundred of a certain population, tens of thousands were forcibly deported to other areas of the USSR. These actions were not done based on material analysis, nor were these actions absolutely necessary. The only somewhat saving grace is the sheer barbarity of the war necessitated such actions, but still, the lesson for the future is clear. A correct and Marxist assessment of a similar situation in the future should result in a very different decision. Point number 9. Purges. Now, the purges are such an incredibly complex topic, and I won't go into all the complexities right now. Suffice to say, though, the common image of the purges in the West is very, very wrong. They were not the actions of some totalitarian godman in order to, quote-unquote, consolidate power, or any other one of their favorite tropes. The reality of the purges was, in fact, way worse. Essentially, a fifth column existed within the Soviet Union, and it attempted to bring down the Soviet government and essentially install a military dictatorship in support of Germany. Unsurprisingly, this fifth column was supported by Germany, as well as many other elements outside the USSR. The real failure on the part of the Soviet leadership was allowing a fifth column such as this to form in the first place. Not only that, but the extent of its influence was so far that it controlled vital aspects of the military, the internal security apparatus, and even parts of the party. The very existence of this means mistakes were done. Certain people were either protected from suspicion for some period, or simply the party wasn't nearly vigilant enough in screening its members. In particular, those with vital positions. This same issue reared its head towards the end of the USSR as well, when not so much a fifth column, but definitely an anti-Soviet and anti-socialist group managed to form, grow, and eventually occupy vital positions within the government, prime example being Yeltsin. Paradoxically, active purges are good at weeding out these elements, and were done since Lenin's time. How you can reconcile active purges with significant vigilance, such that no issues like those in the 30s arise again, I don't know though. Point number 10. Limitations of planning. This is a minor point that has far-reaching consequences. In the USSR and many other socialist countries, planning was done by complex calculations carried out by hand, which meant that it would take a long time to develop plans of a sophisticated level. Because of this limitation, at the most only 10,000 different units within the economy were planned for in the USSR. This amount is laughable nowadays, as a regular smartphone can plan for many times that, and modern supercomputers can plan unfathomably complex, multi-year plans for entire nations. The issue is that, even with the development of computers, the Soviet Union stuck to small-scale planning, and later on broke up the Central Planning Committee into many regional planning committees with non-binding plans, essentially becoming directives that technically don't have to be followed. This happened even though revolutionary new methods for planning with the limitations of the time had taken place, for example with Project Cybersyn in Allende's Chile. In fact, Chile's Cybersyn project was only a small-scale imagining of Glushkov's OGAS system. This system was to essentially be an internet system that spanned the entire territory of the Soviet Union and would have radically eased as well as developed the planning capacity of the USSR. Not only this, but would have most likely developed into a civilian internet network for the spread of information, much like the modern internet. However, we're talking about the 1960s here. It never happened, partly due to an ossified bureaucracy, but also due to the sheer cost. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, but I'm convinced that had OGAS been developed, not only would the USSR still exist today, it would have surpassed the US as the largest economy on Earth even sooner than predicted. Based on the 1980s numbers, the USSR was going to be the #1 economic power by 2005. An excellent article on this topic is Internet: Why the Soviet Union Did Not Build a Nationwide Computer Network. Number 11. Transitioning to a profit-based enterprise system. Among the many mistakes of Khrushchev and the Soviet administration of the time, which include regional planning committees and the selling off of the machine and tractor stations to collective farms, is the transition of the Soviet enterprise to a profit-based system in order to measure productivity, rather than output, quality, or relative performance to economic plans. This created a precedent for profit over more valid criteria in certain sectors of the economy, incentivized the hiring and maintenance of managers that got the most profit, and hence cultivated a capitalist mindset among Soviet managerial sectors. Unsurprisingly, Yeltsin was climbing the ranks during this crucial period. Two good books on this topic include Bill Bland's Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union and Martin Nicolaus's book of the same name. Point number 12, ossification of the Politburo. Somewhat linked to the previous point is the ossification of Soviet leadership, which was a grave error. The average age of members of the Central Committee, primarily, was uncomfortably high. Similarly, although to a lesser extent, this issue was also present with members of the Supreme Soviet. A self-explanatory point, and in my opinion, a more frequent rotation of leadership, at most levels, and a higher percentage of the young can only lead to good for socialist political structures. Point number 13, the Comintern. Another very complicated point, but one I can go over quickly. The idea of coordinating party work and strategy across nations is an incredibly attractive one. However, it suffers from a flaw. One dominant socialist nation will dominate this strategy, in the example of the USSR, and will, unsurprisingly, result in some bad decisions. An example of said decision is the strange coordination of the Chinese Revolution. Such issues, as well as the post-war period in general, caused the Comintern to be abolished. Ideally for the future, a more, let's say, horizontal form of organization can be built up, where a panel of socialist nations and parties switch out leadership and organization. This has many flaws as well, but is just an idea I'm throwing out there. Point number 14, over-bureaucratization. Unsurprisingly, a massive nation such as the USSR needed some level of bureaucracy. This is something all transitionary and socialist nations require for effective organization. But, at the end of the day, when there are too many bureaucrats, inefficiencies occur and a hardened crust of them will make dynamic change more difficult. In line with Lenin's awkwardly titled, Better Fewer but Better, the solution is essentially, well, better fewer but better. Many of the former issues that existed can be fixed with modern computing, but nonetheless this is something we do need to consider. Now there are many other criticisms to be made, but this video is getting long enough. If I didn't mention something you want to hear, either this video has dragged on long enough, or because it isn't really something to criticize. There are a few books I can recommend, of course, the first and foremost being Parentes, Black Shirts, and Reds, again, which you have to read. It discusses many other issues I haven't even touched. On the purges, the works of J. Arch Getty and Grover Furr are excellent, and you should check those out. For a more detailed analysis on which flaws contributed to the illegal dissolution of the USSR, take a look at the book Socialism Betrayed. An interesting but old book on the early propaganda war, as well as other sorts of sabotage and antagonism against the USSR, is The Great Conspiracy from 1946. A quick Google search will bring up the PDF. As for Soviet democracy, you can look up Pat Sloan's book, titled Soviet Democracy. Anything written by Albert Szymanski, for example, Is the Red Flag Flying, or Human Rights in the USSR. Webb's book, called Soviet Communism and New Civilization, or an old book titled The Soviet Form of Popular Government, which explains it in a nicely detailed level. As for planning and cybernetics, look up Cockshot's work, for example, Towards New Socialism, and Medina's book titled Cybernetic Revolutionaries, Technology and Politics in Allende's Chile. That's enough for now. If you like what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Alex Benishek, Carmad Goat, D. Lang, Darius A. Berndahl, James Kavanaugh, John Bernston, John Polland, Noel, Nobody, Paul Luders, Pauline Magdisi, Rocco, Rose Hogginson, Scott Radburn, Alan Plum, Andy Haywood, Brandon Persuade, Coach Cinnamon T, Comrade Benito, Comrade Pingu, Daryl McFarlane, El Juan Tin, Ellie Gerzon, Eugene Seminovsky, Ferret Ahan, Garlic Bread, Grammar Antifa, Granola Joe, Industrial Robot, Job, Jordan Follows, Jovian Archiver, Khan, Kyle Rapp, Liam Sapanan, Libertarian Stalinist, Manda, Mass Strike Now, Matt, Mika Argyropoulos, Michael Reddy Webster, Namratha Prabhu, Nathalie Taylor, Omar Abdul-Jabbar, Parker Cushing, Renkiel Lancaster, Ring, Rudy, Sid Singh, Sussy M, Ted Teddington Tedsville, Toki Mukai, Tristan Druyan, Vereldor, Zatarani, and Zaran Arsen. I'll see you in the next one.